Lucas, thank you for this. Thank you for this interview. It's Tuesday and that, but tell me, I appreciate this, and let's get right to the heart of it. 310, is it good or bad for this community as mayor?
Pete, first of all, thank you for making the time to do this interview. You have a lot of busy things to do too, and this is a great opportunity to communicate with the public. And because of that, I'm going to hold you off. We'll get to 310 in a second. I got a great announcement. Coming up in April, we've got the rideshare bylaw forward. So what does that mean? This is something that Cobourg has taken the lead on about, 4 or 5 months into this new term. And our staff have done an incredible job. Everyone always asks, why don't we have Uber? Why don't we have Lyft? Why don't we have any of these ride sharing apps? Well, we're there. This has been a huge project and something that I wanted to make sure the community knows about, because what's happened is the reason we couldn't get these ride shares is because none of them were interested in a small market to get licensed and all the bylaws required for, say, just Cobourg. So what Cobourg's done is they've taken the lead, and we've included Cobourg, Port Hope, Brighton, and Trent Hills. All 4 of these municipalities have come together, and we've actually created the first of its kind bylaw that's going to be applicable in all 4 of those areas. Why? Well, because this way it makes sense for rideshare companies to come to this market. So now, when you're licensed in Cobourg, you're automatically licensed in Port Hope, Brighton, and Trent Hills. This is how we've now attracted rideshare, and it looks like it's going to be coming due in April. It's taken a little bit maybe longer because, again, this is the first time all of these municipalities have come together to agree on a single bylaw that is then applicable across the county. It's a great step in the direction of sort of seeing shared services, but more importantly, I think it's really important because we've also made sure that we are the largest municipality with taxi cab companies. So we had to do a lot of work to make sure that we did the education and work to show how this is actually going to help the business for everyone and not in any way, shape, or form make it difficult or harder for the taxi cab companies locally. So just a quick announcement. 310. What do you want to know, Pete? Do you want to talk about the bylaw? Do you want to talk about the agreement? What is it you'd like to know? What is your
For the bylaw then, how did that get proposed, or who proposed it, or start off from the beginning on that one?
I think it's great. We'll go really quickly. The bylaw is not, okay, there's some misinformation floating around the community. There's some misinformation that's saying that Cobourg Council is using this bylaw as a way of strong-arming some kind of agreement with the county. I want to be very specific and clear. That is not at all the intention of this bylaw. The reality is that this bylaw was being thought of and sort of tapped upon well before even the announcement of 310. We already were well aware through the lived experience in Cobourg of what the delivery of social services in our community creates. And while we are very fortunate in Cobourg to have these social services here, we're also very aware that there are some byproducts of those services. So this has been something in the Cobourg idea, and along with my council members for many, many months, some of them for years. The bylaw is not about 310 division. I want to be very specific. What we're doing is we're setting a standard of care for a health institution, something that is done across the entire spectrum of our society. Hospitals, they have a standard of care and they have rules and regulations to abide by. Our long-term care facilities, this is a great example of the provincial government stepping in and setting a very clear standard of care that's required to operate a long-term care facility. The argument could easily be made that not having rules and regulations would allow long-term care facilities to run easier and more effectively. But we learned through the pandemic that that's not really a good way to behave. And so what this bylaw is it's actually a bylaw to protect the most vulnerable in our community. When we see the government of Ontario and the government of Canada potentially dumping hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into social programming for those experiencing homelessness, programming for those suffering from addictions, I think it's about time that we have a standard of care, that we hold the people who are providing shelters and that to a baseline. And this isn't saying that Cobourg thinks we know better. What we're doing is we're going on best practices and asking for very simple, basic rules that are agreed to. And if they're broken, then there's follow-up and accountability. We're looking for accountable, transparent institutions. And so this mixing of somehow the bylaw being a way to force an agreement, the two are very separate. An agreement is a best practice, and I want to say the county council gave clear direction to the county staff to work towards an agreement, and Cobourg Council gave clear direction to Cobourg staff to work toward an agreement, and that's what our two CAOs are doing right now. They're going back and forth, and they're finding a commonality to have an agreement. But that agreement is completely separate from a bylaw. And there's been some information going around that this bylaw is being used as some sort of tool to leverage, well, no. And I want to be very clear, for those that didn't see the council meeting, I was very specific on why I wanted to see that bylaw being pushed for a month, to not go into effect until March. Because we wanted to not just drop a bomb on the community. We wanted to give a lot of notice to go, hey, this is coming. This is a bylaw that's in the works. Let's hear about the effect on your institution so that we can, if needs be, make alterations. So we've been meeting with the operators of Cornerstone. We've been meeting with the board of Transition House to understand how this bylaw may impact their operations. All this to say, it would be wonderful if an upper level of government were to take the reins and standardize what is and isn't acceptable standard of care for emergency shelters. But in the absence of that, Cobourg stepping up to make sure that the services provided to our most vulnerable are following best practices and holding the people who are delivering those services to account isn't really a stretch. It's doing the right thing for those most vulnerable in our community. And I think we can see that across all areas of health. We want standards and rules for hospitals to follow. We want standards and rules for treatment centers, and we want standards and rules for our long-term care facilities. So when we're dealing with our most vulnerable in our community, why wouldn't we want a standard of rules and regulations that clearly lay out whose responsibility is what? And that does not impede or negate the need for an agreement between Cobourg, Transition House, and the county. Because that agreement is also very important, because the idea is that that agreement will ensure the community has the buy-in for these services. So it's not an either-or situation. It can be both. And I think what you're going to hear from Cobourg is that this is something that we believe in, not because we're trying to prevent shelter services from within our community, but this is something we believe in because we have the lived experience of putting up with shelter services over the last 5 to 7 years. We've seen the effects and the both positive and negative effects in our community, and we're creating a bylaw which is well within our purview to address those. That was a long answer.
That was a long.
You can think about it for a second, Peter.
Yeah, it's all right. I just don't know where to go with that. So how did the bylaw get created? Like, how did it come to fruition?
That's a great question. So we as a council were talking about how we can move forward. How can we ensure that the residents of Cobourg's concerns are heard? How can we make sure that within our community, the negative effects of social service delivery can be mitigated and worked on? We're not saying this bylaw is going to fix the problems. What we're saying is this is a bylaw is a great starting point. This is a great minimum standards. And we're engaging with all of the various players to make sure that this bylaw is easy to navigate. But the reality is, Pete, is that the long-term care facilities would love to not have to meet the provincial standards. But that's not possible in long-term care homes. And so the argument that's being made that this in some way, shape, or form prevents shelter services in Cobourg by putting a bylaw, well, my argument is if we're putting very basic standard of services that you're not willing to meet, well, why is that? Why aren't you willing to meet a very basic standard of services to...
Talk about the basic standards.
We're talking about security provisions. We're talking about emergency planning. We're talking about policies. We're talking about who's responsible for what. We're talking about who the ultimate liability is. You see, when you draft a bylaw, Pete, there is a process. This isn't some thrown together bylaw. This is a bylaw that was done in consultation with experts, both legal experts and social service experts. And now we're talking to the social service experts in our community to understand how we may need to, say, modify or alter that bylaw But I want to be very clear. It's within our right to draft a bylaw like this, and we're not trying to bylaw people. We're not trying to make rules and regulations against a group of individuals. In fact, that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. What we are doing is we are looking at the institution of shelter services. And we are looking, just like we make bylaws around bars, just like we make bylaws around any operation in our community and any sort of agency, that's appropriate. We have bylaws for stores, we have bylaws for sidewalks, we have bylaws for entranceways and bathrooms. Why wouldn't we have simple bylaws for mitigating standards of care?
What type of agencies will this entail?
In terms of like, who does this affect?
Yeah.
It's an ECE, so it's an emergency care bylaw. So it's specifically around shelter services, emergency shelter services.
Examples of?
Right now, we're looking at Cornerstone or Transition House. The motel program could, in fact, maybe, but again, these are the kind of specific details that are staff-driven. Council gives very clear direction to Cobourg staff. Cobourg staff isn't in the business of making assumptions. So as an example, we just had a meeting yesterday, emergency called meeting. Well, that was based on letters that were received on Friday. So when our staff received letters on Friday, our staff doesn't just make assumptions. Our staff didn't know how to proceed, so an emergency meeting was called on Monday to come to council to get clear direction based on the information received on Friday. This is something that this council should be very proud of and something that this staff should be very proud of, because what you have happening is everyone staying in their lane. Politicians are being political, staff are not. Staff are not telling us what we should and shouldn't care about. They're coming to us and asking us what council wants to do. And I think it's a new era for Cobourg as we move forward in this dynamic. I think it's why we're starting to see so many things start to be accomplished at once. Things like our rideshare, things like a new ECDEV strategy, things like our new planning rezoning. This is all coming to fruition at the same time. And the reason is we're staying out of each other's way to make sure the work gets done. Politicians are being politicians and staff are being staff, and we're making sure that when we're working together, we're doing so in our lanes.
Are you getting any pushback from Cornerstone or Transition House? Like,
I can't speak to I'm not going to assume. I have spoken individually, one-on-one, with a variety of members in the community, and what I'm finding is there is a bit of misinformation. The information that's being put out is that this bylaw somehow threatens emergency response plans. We've heard that this bylaw somehow is preventing Transition House from opening 310, yet we don't actually know how. We've heard that this bylaw could have serious unintended consequences. Well, with respect, I disagree with all of those statements. We don't have a problem with rules and regulations around the operation of long-term care homes. I want to stick to that. It would be much more cost-effective and efficient to not have those regulations. People who provide for-profit long-term care would much prefer there were no bylaws and rules governing their operation. But that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do, because we need to ensure that these centers are providing a standard of care and are following the rules that the rest of our community expect them to follow.
If the county or the town can say yes to this bylaw.
Well, I just want to say, not saying yes, Pete. This bylaw is in effect. All we did is we pushed it back a month till March, the day after our next county meeting.
I see.
Sorry, next after our council meeting, so that we gave it the time to have the staff interactions, to make those last minute changes. We've heard, as an example, we've clearly heard from the county that they're concerned with the emergency management side of it around the eclipse coming up. Well, we've assured them that that's not a concern, and now we're going to make, say, some modifications in our bylaw just to address those two concerns, to clear we're not going to provide that exemption. We don't see it necessary. Instead, we hear their criticisms, we've heard their sort of poignant points that there's maybe a little clarification need. So, So we're going to start working on that on video. So we're going to start working on that side of it. We hear their concerns. We don't share them, but we acknowledge them, and we're going to say maybe change a little of the wording to just ensure that there is no confusion moving forward. So in a sense, we really appreciate the county sort of providing that feedback so that we can have that dialogue and ensure that when the bylaw does go into effect at the end of this month, that it's the best bylaw it can be.
when it comes into effect,
What does that mean?
yeah.
Yeah, nothing. As per any bylaw, it is up for a period of slow integration. You don't just drop a bylaw and then the next day a guillotine goes around it and hammers everything. There's implementation, there's training, there's education. This is several months. So just because the bylaw goes into effect, it doesn't necessarily mean anything's going to change. It just means that that bylaw is now in effect. And we as the town of Cobourg have a way to hold people to account when the time is necessary. This isn't necessarily something that is going to automatically change everything in Cobourg, as some are saying. In fact, it's just another bylaw. And that bylaw then has to be utilized. There has to be a bylaw complaint. There has to be a process. And that's all included in the bylaw. This is, again, not a staff-driven bylaw. This is a bylaw that staff have used both best practices in and that the staff have gone to legal help to draft. Because, Pete, I don't know if you're aware, but just like the ride share is the first time that we've all, as in Northumberland County, worked together to come up with a single bylaw, this is actually the first shelter bylaw from what we can tell in Ontario. This is actually a new standard, and I'm really proud of this council for stepping to the plate. Because in the absence of an upper level government being willing to regulate emergency shelters, it's fallen, unfortunately, to the Cobourg level to do that. And so I'm really proud of the council, I'm proud of the staff and the work, and this bylaw shouldn't be feared. We don't fear rules and regulations around long-term care homes. We don't fear rules and regulations around the hospitals. In fact, we demand them. And the reason we demand them is we know that when we go into a hospital, there's a bare minimum of care. And I said, I don't think we have to look around the community too far to understand that the current standard of shelter care isn't really adequate. And so, again, we're not saying at Cobourg level that we're professionals, but we are saying we know the problems that we're currently experiencing, and we need a methodology for which we can enforce when those rules aren't followed.
So, here's one. Why can't the town enforce what's happening at the former Brookside?
Oh, because that's provincial land.
Even though it's provincial land, though, it's on, like, it's in Cobourg. So
Correct. So
do bylaws not take effect because they're on provincial land?
Well, I mean, I can get into all the legalese if we want, but I'll just sort of summarize it. We are a creature of the province. The town of Cobourg and the county don't exist outside of the creation of the provincial government. So the provincial government literally writes the laws that allow us to exist. And within those laws, there are clauses. Those clauses state that the provincial government gets to choose which of our laws they are being held to account by. Okay, so yes, our bylaws do apply, but it's up to the provincial government to decide if we're allowed to apply those bylaws to them. Okay, and this is part and parcel. So when we talk about, say, an amalgamation, okay, that can simply be by a written law of the provincial government that forces the collapse or combination of governments, because we exist at the behest of the provincial government. So when we're dealing with a place like Brookside, yes, we have bylaws, and yes, they're applicable if and when the provincial government decides for them to be applicable. Okay, and so that's why, and I think that's why you're seeing the quick sell of Brookside. It's on the market. We've been told that it's most likely going to close sometime in March or April. Once it's no longer provincial property, then yes, this will then become part of a different equation. Just like if you or I had an encampment on our front lawn, it would be a different set of rules. Well, that's because you and I aren't the provincial government, and that's not throwing the provincial government under the bus. It would be inappropriate for the provincial government to step in and address this one encampment. Because the reality of the fact here is, Pete, is if you go to Peterborough, what is that, 50 or 60 encampments? You go to Kingston, there's 150 encampments. Like, there are thousands of encampments around the province, many of them on provincial land. So if the province starts showing up and evicting this encampment in this one spot, well, what's stopping the rest of, you see what I'm saying? It's a quagmire that the province, I don't see necessarily wanting to wade into.
One of the things I always wondered, and it's not a question, but one of the things I've always wondered if they can do that, I've always wondered why they don't, the homeless don't camp out on Queen's Park.
Well, listen, I'm not here to.
But as I say, that's just a comment.
Not something I would recommend. But
I mean, like, because it's the same thing. It's provincial, but they. So I guess for, I guess it's wait and see, in other words, what happens.
Well, no, I don't think it's wait and see. I think what's happening is what you're seeing is a very concerted effort by the CAO at County and the CAO of Cobourg. They've met, they're working hard. We've got the politics out of this agreement. At least that's the intention. The intention was that we wanted the staff to come to an agreement because we don't want this to be a political debacle. We don't want this to be a political fight. What we want is the staff to come together and work out an agreement that works for both County and Cobourg. They're the professionals. They're the ones that know their problems. At Cobourg, we've got our bylaw, we've got our police, we've got our fire. We know what we're dealing with. So we need to take their concerns. The county are the professional social service delivery. They know what they can do and what they can't do. Great. So by putting the people who are on the ground in Cobourg and the people who are professional social service delivery agents together through our two CAOs, that's the hope of an agreement.
And you think this is the first one for the province, eh?
From what I can tell, there is no bylaw on record that talks about the regulation of emergency shelters.
It has to be, and again, correct me, but I mean, it has to be as specific. In other words, Cobourg isn't unique by any means, but the city of Toronto, Kingston governs itself, so it wouldn't apply to them.
I would say the city of Cobourg is unique in their willingness to stand up for what is right. And I think Cobourg Council is unique in the sense that they're willing to do what is right for the most vulnerable individuals in our community at the expense of being cast out like they're anti-vulnerable individuals. Because what's being happened is we're being viewed at the Cobourg Council as being anti-shelter, as being anti-homeless, as being but that is just a story that's being told by a group of individuals that don't want to follow the rules that are being put into place. Listen, I'm a business guy. I would love if there weren't rules in place for how I run a business. I'd make a lot more money. If I was running a business without standards and requirements, if I didn't have to have the fire emergency exits, if I didn't have to have all the things that are required within Cobourg to open a business, I would have saved $100,000 in the operation of opening of my business. So I understand the logic. I'm proud of Cobourg for standing with.
Yeah, what I mean is that Cobourg's in a county situation. Toronto
the two tiers.
Yeah, Toronto wouldn't be, Kingston wouldn't be, Peterborough isn't. So Cobourg is a relatively small, so that's why the county comes into effect.
Agreed, Pete. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic because I'm in a very interesting role. Here I am at the county level, and when the vote came up about 310, well, I don't get to be the mayor of Cobourg on that vote. And as a county councillor, well, of course we want a better shelter. We know that the old transition house wasn't good. We know, or it wasn't as good as it could be. I want to be very clear. They've made great improvements in the last year, so I want to make sure I state that clearly. But we know there are issues. We know that they are not accessible rooms. We know they're not individual rooms. There's no locks on the door. So we've heard from the individuals at the encampment all the problems with the current transition house. So as a county councillor, I was so excited for the opportunity that we could change our shelter services. We could actually provide quality care. Then I come down to the Cobourg level, and I'm now the mayor of Cobourg. And at that level, I'm also supportive of taking care of our most vulnerable. That's what we're elected to do. I'm not elected to just care for the people with a mortgage. We're elected to care for all of Cobourg residents, those that rent, those without homes, and those with mental health and addiction issues. And so representing all of them, I have to look at, we know the shelter services being provided aren't doing the job that's needed. And we also know that when these shelters are put in a community, there is a ramification for that community. So how do we mitigate for the residents of Cobourg? And so it's very interesting because a lot of people are maybe unsure of how I can vote for 310 at the county, but then also be in support of a bylaw and agreement at Cobourg. And I don't think the two are mutually exclusive.
One of the last things I will say, if you can comment on, is like the eclipse is coming, but it might be cloudy. So even with 310 coming or transition house, just because it's here, it doesn't mean it's going to solve all the problems.
Oh gosh, no, and I don't think anyone.
But that's one of the hard things that I think
for
people, because just because it's here, you could spend millions or more, but that doesn't mean that the people that may need it are going to use it.
I think, Pete, what you're touching on is something that I've had to learn a lot of. I give a lot of credit to the staff up at County. This is a continuum of care that we're talking about. It's not emergency shelters. An emergency shelter isn't the end all and be all of a continuum of housing solutions. At Cobourg, we're seeing what we can do to fix the housing situation. You're seeing the fast tracking of projects. You're seeing projects getting pumped through with our planning and our engineering department to deal with the housing issues in Cobourg, to pull down the red tape. I mean, our community last year hit a 5% housing growth. That's insane. That's great. 5% in 1 year we increased our housing stock. In 1
Do you
year.
know how many houses that?
It's about 400 houses, just give or take. So that's a big deal. Where you see most municipalities are in the 0.2 to 0.4 growth rates. We're sitting at 5% in year 1. Wait till we're hitting year 4 with this council, okay? Second of all, I think when you talk about it's not going to solve everything, well, of course not. What we really need to start doing is looking at substance abuse solutions. What we need to start looking at is rehab. We've already seen that too. Mayor Hankivsky of Port Hope put forth a motion where now the county has put $250,000 into for-profit rehab beds for individuals who are ready to go and make a change in their life. So shelter services are part of the solution, and no one's denying that. And in terms of, you're right, it's not going to fix the problem, but it's a start. And you never can fix everything at once. This is what I've always said, progress over perfection. You're right, 310 division isn't a catch-all solution, and we're right, there are going to be issues. But one step in front of the first, 310 is a good idea. Next step is, how do we ensure that when 310 is operating, that there aren't the same negative side effects, knowing that there are going to be different side effects, and that we will then need to sort of move forward on that.
Like any place.
Like any
Emergency shelter.
We have to start understanding that there are good standard practices that should be implemented, and having a bylaw just ensures that everyone is following the same set of rules, and that the county doesn't get an exemption, that Cornerstone, that everyone is following the standard of care that Cobourg residents demand and expect for our most vulnerable. And we should talk about stormwater fees one time, Pete. I don't know if today's the day, but
Sure.
okay, well, we've got stormwater fees. Everyone's up in arms about it, and I think it's a good thing to talk about. This is a decision from the previous council, and this is, again, isn't me talking or throwing the previous council under the bus. The previous council realized, because the province mandated, that we start looking at our long-term asset management. And the first thing the last term of council did is they looked at our stormwater. And when we did the studies, we realized that we were $1.2 million a year short in funding our stormwater reserves. That's a big deal for 20,000 residents. Okay, so the previous term of council decided that they didn't want to just hammer it onto the property taxes, because then the big corporations like Walmart and Home Depot and the large landholders wouldn't pay an equal share. In fact, then the majority of those stormwater charges would land on people who already have exorbitantly high property tax rates. So the previous council made the decision to put it on the size of people's land. Now, this came out. And for the average Cobourg resident, the bill's $50 to $70. That's what the stormwater for the year. There are some very specific individuals. I'm going to give one example. There's one group of individuals who own 96 or 97 acres of land in Cobourg. Now, their stormwater bill is $15,000. They, along with various other large landholders in Cobourg, came to council, and they asked us to rethink the stormwater billing. Well, I just want all of Cobourg to understand what that means. So, if council decides to rethink and put a cap on stormwater, that will be the will of council. But let's just use one example. So that 97-acre parcel that's $15,000 currently, if we put a cap of $200 on them, okay, that's great for them. But that $14,800 doesn't not need to be paid. It gets spread amongst the rest of the residents of Cobourg. Okay, and I need Cobourg to understand this, that I'm not saying there's not a more equitable way to divide these costs, or that the stormwater fees aren't disproportional for some individuals. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the community at large needs to understand what is being asked of Cobourg Council. What they're being asked to do is to provide caps to certain individuals who own large property, so that those costs can be shared amongst other residents of Cobourg. They're not going to go away. They're just going to be paid by other people, which means these individuals, and I'm going to go back to that 97 acres, because it's agricultural land, their property tax is $2,000 a year. Well, sorry, 90 plus acres and you're paying $2,000 in property taxes. Yet we look at condos on the waterfront paying $10,000 property taxes for 1,100 square feet. And these individuals and these groups that have these large acreages want people who are already disproportionately paying higher property taxes to bear now more load of the stormwater fees. Okay, I just think that my job is to represent the majority of Cobourg. And I just think it's appropriate and poignant to point out to the majority of Cobourg that at this present time, we have staff re-looking at how to bill stormwater. And those recommendations are going to come forward. And I think the majority of Cobourg may want to pay attention, because we don't want to be listening to a minority group of large landowners to save them money to disproportionately put those costs on everyone else. And I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm saying I expect the community, and I hope the community is going to start paying attention and having that conversation. Because this group of individuals did a lot of work and a lot of research, and my hat's off to them, because they came well prepared, they came well orchestrated, they came with good political knowledge of how to speak to a council and how to convince us that we need to rethink this. And we listen to them. But I don't think enough of Cobourg on the other side realizes what, if they're successful, will happen. So if these individuals are successful in putting a cap on their $15,000 bill, that just means the rest of us will be paying for that $15,000 bill.
Simple question, basic question, just in case. What is a stormwater fee?
Perfect. So a stormwater fee is what we've called it. Basically, we need to put more money away for our asset management of stormwaters. Full stop. It's not based on a usage. Whereas when you pay bills for like water or gas, you pay a usage fee. This is essentially a fee or a tax in the sense that we know we need to start saving more money. Full stop. And I mean, we don't have to. The community can say, no, we don't want stormwater fee, and we don't want you to think for the future. But what happens is then we don't have enough reserves to pay for expenses in the future, and we have to debenture all of it. And you guys know what interest rate's at now. So I'm a believer that we should be saving for the future, not rolling the dice and hoping that nothing wrong goes, especially with the kind of expansion. So what is it? It's a way of us saving for the future for our infrastructure costs that we know we're going to have. Full stop. So we don't have to put away stormwater fees. And if that's what the community tells the council, then I guess we could vote that way. But I have more faith in the council, because I know my council understands that making the right decision is often not making the politically popular decision. And it's appropriate for us to save money here, Pete. We need to, and this is just stormwater. In 2025, you're going to see a full asset management plan. And I think there's going to be some real sticker shock as to the community, something I've been sort of alluding to the last two budget cycles. We need to put more money away for the rainy day, because this is an old community with old infrastructure.
Well, I got you. What about the pier?
Yeah, see, that's a classic example. Yes. So here we are with the pier. We're looking at a 20 to 30 million retrofit if we did it properly. Okay, but we haven't saved appropriately for it. And I'm not about to go and ask for a $30 million debenture so we can walk out on the pier. Now, we're borrowing money for water towers. That's appropriate because we need those water towers. But it's very difficult to justify a $30 million debenture so that everyone can have a nice walkout on the pier. Now, had we, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago, set up a pier fee where everyone was paying $20 to $50 a year towards that, we would have had the money in a bank for the pier. Or if we had, say, reduced our operating expenses, thereby allowing more money to go into reserves, that could have solved the problem. Or we could ensure that we never touch our reserves for operations. That's a big one. I really, whether I'm the mayor or anyone else is the mayor or whoever's in charge, I think we as a community need to ensure that moving forward, we do not allow politicians to use reserves for operations to avoid making difficult decisions.
Lifeguard stands.
Yeah, what about them, Pete?
Not gonna do lifeguards this year. Like how long they were bought for? I believe 110. This is before you were mayor, but I mean, are they gonna
Well, they're there for a safety reason now. I want to be very clear. So the lifeguard towers are there for search and rescue operations. They're clear markers on the GPS to allow if there was an incident and if the Coast Guard had to come, they have clear positional markers to decide.
So even though like we got $110,000 safety markers, in other words.
Listen, Pete, I can't go back and fix and decide. The
I know. I
reality-
just wondered if we
Yeah,
could,
and
like
don't-
if they're not going to be used, like rather than let them sort of disintegrate over the years, it'd be nice to get a buck for them.
That's not a
somewhere,
bad
some-
suggestion, Pete, and here
Yeah.
we are. So maybe one of my council members puts that
Yeah.
forward. We talked to Brian, Mr. Gertz and that could be a possibility. I'm not going to rule that out. I want everyone to know, we also need a place to post the signs that there are no lifeguards present. That's also a really good place for it.
Last question, and I know this is minor. Do you know when your little Christmas lights are coming down?
Sorry, what, Pete?
Christmas lights. They're all along town. They've been on the street lamps for.
So you got me. You got me. That's the aha moment. I don't. I didn't even know that. So I'll be very honest. You caught me. That's a good aha. I don't know when the Christmas lights are coming down.
Good. Thank you very much for your time. Anything else you want to say?
Again, I'd like to say thanks, Pete, for taking this. I know I've heard a lot of comments in the public that they really appreciate this sort of back and forth we have every once in a while. So thank you for taking the time to do this. I'd also like to say thank you to the county councillors. They have been very, very supportive of Cobourg in this. The county has sort of, from my perspective, stepped up and been very clear that we're going to support Cobourg and we're going to work with Cobourg. And it's been incredibly rewarding and appreciated that I'm seeing my councillors at the county step forth and move in a direction of conciliatory, working together attitude. It's starting to happen when we talk about the potential of police, we talk about it with fire, we talk about now the ride share coming across. Pete, the reality is we need to start looking at what the future for Northumberland County is, what that looks like in terms of, are there some major changes geographically in governance? Do we have to start thinking about maybe we don't need 7 lower tiers? Maybe we could move in a different direction. And I'm very excited to hear the language being used by my fellow county councillors of shared services, looking for ways that we can come together as 7 separate counties and reduce the cost to our taxpayers. So I just a thank you out there to my county councillors for that, moving in that direction, for supporting Cobourg, and also a huge shout out to Cobourg Council. We've really hit a stride here as a team. I'm proud of. It's not that we're not disagreeing. It's not that we're not having fulsome discussions. It's not that there's not definitely some good discussion, but the way in which the council is operating, the way in which we are staying clear of operations, and the way in which our staff are trusting us to come to us with the difficult decision and asking us each and every one. I'm so proud of the work that the staff and that Cobourg has come together, and you can see it in the sense that we are now doing what is right, what is hard. We know this bylaw is going to be difficult, and yet here we are standing our ground as a team, united, working for the betterment of our community.